Hi, I'm Em.
And my name is Bea.
And this is
Fangirls Anonymous. A quick warning, this podcast is not for kids.
We get into some pretty explicit stuff.
But if you're still with us and into that, welcome. Hey Em.
Hi, Bea.
How are we doing today?
We are good. Today's been very productive. How about you?
Today has been a beautiful sunshiny day and I have enjoyed frolicking with my cats.
That sounds like a dream. I miss having cats. Anyway, today we're doing a fun episode.
What are we talking about?
We are talking about old fic. Our listeners might be thinking about like maybe fic from the very earliest of the internet, right? Mid-90s.
Mm-hmm. Or if they could be thinking a little bit further back, they could be thinking Star Trek.
Yes, they could, like talking about like fanzines and stuff like that. But no, we are not going to be talking about any of those things. We are talking about really old fan fiction. Fan fiction you may not know about, and also stories that you've heard of or read that you may not know are fanfic.
Or could be considered that, depending on your slant. I'm sure there are lots of academics who would argue the point with you.
The history of fanfic, some would say, ranges from the Arthurian Legends and Virgil's Aeneid to Jane Austen and Sherlock Holmes. Obviously, there's a lot more than that. Let's just say that we're going to be talking a lot about classics that you wouldn't consider when thinking about fanfiction. So, just to get into it, Don Quixote, the famous novel by Cervantes. It was originally 2 volumes. The first one was released in 1605, and the second one was released in 1615. It's now always released in like just 1 volume, but it was released in 2 parts, basically. And people waited 10 whole years for it. So it's kind of understandable that this guy named Alonso Fernandez de Avellaneda, he published an unauthorized sequel titled Second Book of the Ingenious Knight Don Quixote of La Mancha. And a lot of people were duped. They thought that it was actually the next installment or the last installment of the Don Quixote series, basically, at the time. He released it in 1614. Cervantes was in the middle of writing the second volume when Avellaneda released his unauthorized sequel. Actually, let me read this quote that I found online. Throughout the second volume, Don Quixote meets characters who are aware of him from the publication of his first volume, him being Avellaneda. However, in chapter 59, Don Quixote, the character, learns of Avellaneda's book and is outraged by the way it portrays him. From then on, the Avellaneda publication is ruthlessly mocked over the course of that book. He avoids going to a jousting tournament because such an event took place in the Avellaneda edition. And at another point, Don Quixote even meets a character from Avellanada's work, Don Alvaro Tarf, and gets him to sign an affidavit that the two have never met before. Cervantes also added a foreword to his second volume, where he directly addressed Avellaneda and suggested some rather unusual anecdotes the audience should pass along should they see him. It also addressed several accusations that Avellaneda made against Cervantes over the course of his work. However, the overall impact of Cervantes' response was that it actually placed Avellanada's work into the real Don Quixote story. While the stories Avellaneda told are not official, the work itself exists in the Don Quixote story, solely for the purpose of being mocked and debunked. So Cervantes, throughout the second novel, basically smack-talked Avellaneda. It's actually hilarious. But it also kind of maybe a little bit taints the story, because the story's different now because of a sequel that eventually nobody liked. And obviously Cervantes didn't like. So, I don't know. It's kind of interesting history right there, especially because it's not that Don Quixote is fanfiction. The book that was written, that was unauthorized, is fanfic. But a fanfic affected a really famous story. So it's like a little bit fanfic-y because it directly talks about fanfiction a little bit in the book. So It's kind of weird.
The next one that we're going to talk about is, I'm going to admit, the one that I know the least about out of all of these. We're going to talk about Paradise Lost by Milton. And if any of you have had the great pleasure to read that book in a college course, you're probably going to be like, ah, yeah, I can see it. Because my understanding of the book is that it is essentially Milton said to himself, what if I took the creation story from the Bible and I really dug into it? And you know what? What if I really explored Satan as a character, Lucifer before he fell, and I write an entire novel about that? So he did, which is, it's pretty easy to see how that's fan fiction because he's taking the Bible and writing his own original story with those same characters and a lot of the same plot elements and outlines, but not exactly the same, especially because he's taking what is generally considered an antagonist character and trying to make them at least slightly sympathetic in his work, which is also a really interesting take given the religious atmosphere at the time at which he wrote it, but that's neither here nor there. I think it's a little bit more interesting to note that the use of the Bible specifically was the origin, because I think nowadays a lot of people would look at that and go, wow, that's taking that a little bit far, that's people's beliefs, maybe that's off limits. And it wasn't that it was different back then. I think it was that if there was one work that could be relied upon for pretty much everybody in the Christian Western world to be familiar with, it was gonna be the Bible. Everybody knew it. So it almost feels like it was the low-hanging fruit fic-wise, because, maybe people knew about Shakespeare, and maybe there were some other contemporary authors that were quite popular at the time, but everybody knew the Bible. And it's an interesting thing to think about, that you could rely on people to know this one work, even if it was crossing lines, maybe?
Yeah. I also think it's interesting how humans have always, or maybe like specifically artists, have always been interested in getting to understand the villain of a story more. They tend to be pretty interesting characters themselves, so that makes sense. But like humans want to understand why characters do bad things. And that happens a
Mhm.
lot in fic too, like contemporary fic. Fic writers love to write a lot of Loki fiction, fan fiction.
I'm gonna put out there that the quintessential character is the namesake of the trope, Draco in leather pants. The trope is named after Draco Malfoy from the Harry Potter series, and it has to do with several big name fans who decided to sort of give him their own redemption arc or write stories in which he was more of a protagonist. And in a lot of those, they made him very beautiful and very sexually attractive, hence the leather pants thing. And so it kind of became a tongue-in-cheek way of referring to stories that take an antagonist character or a villain and sort of flip the script and make them the sexy, charming protagonist. And there is something hilarious about the fact that you can unironically say that Milton, Draco in leather pants, Satan. There's just something so beautiful about that sentence.
That is so amazing. I need it on a t-shirt right now. I mean, there's also kind of a link between Loki and Draco in that they're both villains of the story, yet they both become heroes in a way. Obviously, fanfiction takes everything to the nth degree, but in their original canon, they're originally the baddies in like the earlier iterations of those like IPs. But then as the IPs grew older, those baddies became less and less like bad and almost directly started helping the heroes eventually when like Voldemort and Thanos became a thing respectively in Harry Potter and the MCU. So it's like if there's a redemption arc in the original IP, then obviously fanfiction's going to take that and run with it. So, Alexander Dumas, famously, he wrote The Three Musketeers, and he actually wrote The Three Musketeers after reading the book Memoires de Monsieur d'Artagnan that he checked out from the Marseille Public Library and then never returned. And he prefaced the novel, The Three Musketeers, explaining that the characters that he used in his book were originally from the book Memoires de Monsieur d'Artagnan. And he just really wanted to figure out what other adventures they would get up to, which is good because fic writers need to take their time with their author notes and definitely make sure that everybody knows what the original canon is and stuff like that. But I just think that's so funny that The Three Musketeers is so famous, but the original book Memoires de Monsieur d'Artagnan is not. I just think that's pretty great, and I don't think many people really know that. Not even fic writers.
It's interesting because it feels almost like that one. There is a little bit of a gray zone, because at what point are you writing fic and at what part are you writing an adaptation, or is all written adaptations inherently some form of fic?
I mean, I think there's a line. He took the characters from the book
Mm-hmm.
and then made a whole story using those characters. I would consider that fan fiction. But then if you consider Shakespeare, most people know, if they know anything about Shakespeare, he took stories that most people knew about and then just made them better. And I don't think that is fan fiction. I think that's truly adaptation. It's a gray area. I would say that if you're taking whole personalities or characters, or not word for word obviously, but like the whole concept of a book, or a whole character or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely consider that fanfic. But if you're adapting it, you're making it a little bit your own. I mean, nobody considers 50 Shades of Grey, the books themselves, as fanfic.
Even if that's where they originated.
Exactly. So she adapted her own fanfic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where the line is kind of. It's
Mm-hmm.
gray though. Like it's a shade. It's a hazy line.
Yeah. Speaking of fuzzy lines, I think that's a good lead into the next one that I want to talk about, which is, weirdly enough, Homer. If you know who Homer is, you're going, that's the Odyssey, like, that's not a fic, that's one of the oldest stories that we have. And you'd be right, sort of, because there's a pretty good theory going around that Homer was not one person. It was several people who all wrote under this name, composing this epic together. And it's a little bit unclear whether this was some people working in conjunction, or it was somebody wrote something and somebody worked off of it and somebody worked off of it, and they all just sort of kept the name Homer on the cover. Either way, though, it's interesting because it's, again, a gray line of perhaps a slightly different shade than Dumas was working with, because they were original works at some point. At the same time, if it was several different authors, poets, whatever you'd like to call them, working sort of off of work sequentially, so somebody would write something and somebody would work off of that and somebody would work off of their work and so on through time. It's sort of like if somebody read Harry Potter and wrote a really long fic, and then somebody else also read Harry Potter and the really long fic and went, oh, these are both really good. What if I write another fic that's based on these two things? And then somebody else just got that one and was like, oh, this is really good. Let me continue writing it. So it's almost like a daisy chain of fic. It's interesting to consider the fact that, well, the Odyssey may be fan fiction of itself.
Yeah, at what point does it become fic when it's a bunch of people? Like, at what point in the telephone chain does somebody decide that, oh, now it's a fan fiction? You know? Like,
Mm-hmm.
because obviously somebody had to create the original story, and then, like, somebody else added an arm, and somebody else gave it an eye, and somebody else gave it a pinky toe. When did it become a whole thing? When did it become the Frankenstein? Or, sorry, Frankenstein's monster? That's a fun little philosophical query. Man, I love that. So it's funny that you're talking about Homer, because I have some stuff about the Aeneid from Virgil. So this is a lot. Get ready, partners. We have our boy, Julius Caesar, okay? And he's in Rome hearing about these great classics that Greece has. And he gets jealous that Greece has Homer's The Odyssey and the Iliad. And he's thinking to himself, you know what? Rome and me, we both need a classic. So he makes the poet Virgil write the Aeneid, which is itself a fanfic, because the Aeneid, its main character, is a character that it's like a smaller character in the Iliad. So that's a fanfic. But then there are a couple more layers. Dante's Inferno is a pretty famous fanfic. It's about Dante, like it's about himself. So it's a self-insert fic that kind of mashes up the Aeneid and Greek mythology and the Bible. And he goes into all the different layers of hell and all that jazz. But he's led by one of his poet heroes, Virgil. And Virgil guides him through hell. So there are like 3 different fanfic things happening over here. I also just want to say, quick shout out to Over the Garden Wall. It's a Cartoon Network TV show from the 2014, and it is this generation's Dante's Inferno. It's very good. I'll have a link to a video on YouTube about how it is Dante's Inferno and all of the symbolism and all that jazz. The show itself is, it only has 10 episodes long, and they're all 12 minutes long. So it's about the length of a film, and it's really good, and y'all should watch it if you haven't. Anyway, just wanted to say that. But yeah, I think it's really funny that not only did Virgil write fanfic in his day, but Dante wrote a fanfic with Virgil in it later on.
Yeah, that's bonkers.
Yeah, it's bonkers. Yeah, you're right.
The Matryoshka doll of fanfic.
Perfect. That's perfect.
So, just to continue this vein of weird building upon itself fractal fic, I guess, we should talk about the Arthurian Legends. I'm going to be kind of broad strokes about it, but if you want to learn more about this, I would recommend an excellent video by Overly Sarcastic Productions on this very topic. But the long and the short of it is, the Arthurian Legends did not spring fully formed from the head of any one author. A lot of the more famous renditions, Le Morte were somewhere between a fic of and an adaptation of older oral tradition. Somewhat more organized, somewhat made more consistent, I guess is the way I would put it. And that's not saying much, because if you ever actually read them, they're a little bit rambly and confusing. But the cycles as we know them are really the handiwork of dozens of unnamed authors, a lot of which took existing legends and tweaked them and twisted them or added characters for whatever they wanted or needed. So, for example, the Knight of the Round Table Percival, or Parzival, depending on what legend specifically you want to read about him, was originally a Welsh character who was a Welsh hero god, who was then sort of absorbed into Arthur's legends via the power of colonizing narratives. And then the Germans decided he was really cool and wrote books and musicals about him. And then he sort of got, thrown back at England, and England went, oh, we like the German version, and that's sort of what most people would probably recognize. So he technically existed, and then he got adapted, ficked, fanoned into a different character over time, as opposed to, say, Lancelot, who was just sort of invented wholesale and inserted into the story by some French person, which is hilarious, because if you know about Lancelot's story, he just sort of messes everything up. Like, I love him as a character, but really, his job in the story is mostly just to be awesome and mess everybody else up. So the fact that he is a whole cloth character that got shoved into the legends and then stuck is hilarious.
Poor Lancelot.
It's interesting, because then, in terms of fic, you could argue that a large part of it is fic or was fic, because then it became its own original content. Because then you've got shows like Merlin, which obviously are yet a different take on, and you could argue that Merlin is a form of fan creation in reference to these legends.
God, Merlin is so good and so bad at the same time. I love it with my little heart, but I know it's bad. I will say the fic is surprisingly good for that show. Anyway, yeah, that's crazy about Arthur. I think a lot of people consider it's just the Arthurian Legends, but no, it's also a hodgepodge of different beings and ideas and stories and authors and all that jazz. So, my final finding for this episode is a lot of Jane Austen stuff. So, I love me a good Jane Austen or specifically Pride and Prejudice AU. I really do. I love me some Pride and Prejudice AU on AO3. But apparently, before AO3 existed, other people felt the same way. So, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Northanger Abbey, which is surprisingly my favorite one. I love Pride and Prejudice, but Northanger Abbey just has such heart to it, and it's shorter too, which makes it kind of a beach read. Those are all famous books. Everybody knows about them. I don't think a lot of people know about Old Friends and New Fancies by Sybil G. Brinton. This book was written, well, it was published in 1913. I don't know when it was written. But there were like a lot of people who loved Jane or Jane Austen. They called themselves Janeites. I might consider myself a Janeite, but it sounds very religious, so I don't know. But Janeites were like super duper into Jane Austen. It was considered a cult of dedicated literary fans, which is fun. If I'm to be in a cult, that's the one I would want to be in. But one of them, Sybil Britton, published this book called Old Friends and New Fancies. It's kind of a really good example of continuation fic. So it continues the storylines of the same characters in some of Jane Austen's novels, and it's fun. So that's just an example of like an older book that was published using the same characters and continuing on their stories, basically. Now, the Jane Austen Fanfiction Index catalogs over 200,000 works of Austen fanfic, while Goodreads currently lists 242 published books of fanfic derived from Austen. Titles include Vanity and Vexation and Dating Mr. Darcy. Also, just fun fact, a lot of Austen fanfic stories are pornographic. And that's all information from an article titled "In the Beginning There Was Fanfiction from the Four Gospels to 50 Shades." We'll have it in the show notes. But it's just kind of fun that it's pornographic now. That society is comfortable enough to, read pornographic Jane Austen stuff. But, 242 books. Published books. Like that's not fanfic. Like that's published novels that derive from Austen stuff. I guess it's an adaptation in that regard, but I wouldn't consider Old Friends and New Fancies as an adaptation. The author explicitly took characters from Jane Austen's repertoire of characters and then like continued the story. So I would say that's pure fanfic from 1913.
In that same vein, not Austen, but Bronte, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, has an extremely famous companion fic to the novel that I'm fairly certain a lot of people recognize. It's a fairly common book, at least in my experience, to read in high school or college, called The Wide Sargasso Sea. And it is a retelling of the novel Jane Eyre from the point of view of not the titular Jane Eyre, but from, and spoiler warning here, her employer and eventually husband's crazy wife that he locked in the attic. It flips the script. It talks about some of the implications of what is essentially a colonist narrative and its relationship to native peoples or peoples who are not from England and then being in England, and it has to do with mental health and feminism and a whole lot of broad topics. And it can be read without ever reading Jane Eyre, but if you've read Jane Eyre, it's pretty clear that it is somebody who looked at this novel and went, the crazy wife is way more interesting than anybody else in this novel, and I want to know about it. And that one is, I believe, our most contemporary published fic. It's a good example of, I think, fic asking deeper questions of the original narrative, which is one of the fun things that fic can do, and also dealing with and addressing some of the problems in the narrative. You can't read Jane Eyre and not go, wow, that's not a great look for some of the things that happen for a number of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, in Jane Eyre, I know that the aunt was despicable, but when you think of the novel, I think you would consider the crazy woman in the attic as kind of sinister.
Mm-hmm.
So a little bit villainous. Obviously, she's not. She's dealing with so much, and like,
well, I'm not sure that the Wide Sargasso Sea excuses her mistakes, but I think it explains them, because she isn't, at the end of the day, a kind person or a nice person, but she has a lot of reasons for that, including the fact that she got locked in an attic. That kind of isolation is going to make anybody go a little bit nuts.
But yeah, in the book, in Jane's eyes, she's a sinister being that is, messing with things and ultimately burns the castle down. Sorry, spoilers for an 1800s novel. But what's interesting about that's just another fic that goes into the kind of the villain of the story and figures out their motivations. Humans love doing that, I guess.
Yeah, it's weirdly popular in certain ways, because I feel like more contemporary ones, or people who are really trying to rock the boat, tend to try and get in the villain's head, whereas if you take Arthur, for example, nobody ever wrote Mordred's story, really. Nobody ever really wrote Morgana's story.
Merlin did.
Merlin did, but again, much more contemporary. Like, if you're
True.
looking at something that was folded into the cycle itself, if it ever did get written, it was never very popular. We don't know about it.
I mean, there is, Beowulf, and then somebody wrote Grendel. That's not recent, I don't think. But it's bad. It's not a very good. No offense to Grendel fans out there. So it's like, it also has to be good fan fiction in order for people to be like, wow, this is a continuation, or this is a look into the mind of the villain, or something like that. I don't know. I mean, if there was something about Mordred or Morgana, then it probably wasn't very good. That's all I'm saying.
Or it wasn't very popular for a variety of other reasons, because we can't take the time period out of the equation.
The context is always important. Perspective is always important. Yeah.
And what people desire out of the narrative is always important, because what you want out of Jane Eyre informs what kind of fic you're going to write about it. So, like you said about the Austen novels, if people want porn in their Austen, they're going to put it there.
Oh man, that's kind of a lot of fanfic. It's a whole section of fanfic. Taking a story that you love and putting porn in it.
Yeah, it is.
I didn't think this episode would end like that, but I think we're done. I think we've talked a lot. Fic is so much older than most modern people are willing to think about, I'd say. It's also, I think it kind of reframes a lot of these stories that we've talked about during this episode. Now that I think of Dante's Inferno as fan fiction with 2 RPF characters, basically, if RPF means real person fic, just to let y'all know, it kind of reframes it for me as a more accessible text, because everybody touts it as Dante's Inferno, but when I know that the author just put himself into it and put his hero as one of the main characters as well, I'm like, that's what everybody does online. That's what 13-year-olds do. With their fic. So why is it so daunting to read it? It shouldn't be. I think humans have always been humans, and fic has always been fic. And that's comforting to me.
That is very true.
Okay, so Red Corner! Mine this week is What Our Souls Are Made Of by Lissadiane. So it is a steric fic. It's from Teen Wolf, and Styles can see the ghosts of animals. I love a good character that can see some ghosts. I really do. But it's only 14K. It's well written, and he and Derek fall in love, but besides Derek being really hot, the reason why Styles is interested in him is because there's a ghost wolf that hangs around Derek, and Styles has never seen any wild animals hang around a human before, so it's kind of a mystery for him because he doesn't know about werewolves in this fic. Werewolves do exist, so that's the reason why the wolf is hanging around, because it's just a werewolf in full werewolf form as opposed to, like, half wolf, half human kind of thing. It's very sweet. It's a quick read too. It would probably take you half an hour, but yeah, I recommend.
So my rec this week is A Way Things Should Be by LullabyKnell, and it is a Hobbit fic. It's Jen. The best way to describe it is if I just read the first paragraph of the summary, which is, in the Shire, hobbits say, "What lovely weather we're having." They also stir their teacups for 4.5 clockwise rotations, place their left elbow 7/8 down the way of the armrest, and sniffle pointedly, which roughly translates to, "This tea is oversteeped and bland, your furniture is both uncomfortable and horrifically tasteless, and you are a twit of a host." And the premise is that hobbits have this sort of intricate body language that they use to add meaning to whatever they're saying, or to say things in opposition. It's its own sort of sign language almost. And so it's a retelling of The Hobbit in which Bilbo speaks this language, but none of the dwarves do, nor do they know that it exists. So they keep saying ridiculous, hilarious things that he's just sort of affronted and offended and confused by. There's one dwarf who keeps insisting that he's like his third grandmother, and there's another one that just sort of keeps propositioning him, but like it's really clear that he has no idea he's doing it. And it's hilarious. It is definitely a little bit crackish, but in sort of the best ways, so.
Love it. All right, I think we're done.
I guess we'll see y'all next week.
On Fangirls Anonymous. Bye!